My husband of 3 years allowed his mistress to push me into the water. Faced with the choice of accompanying her for a prenatal checkup or saving me, he chose the former. I ended up in a coma due to oxygen deprivation to my brain. When I woke up, my husband mistakenly thought I had lost my memory and eagerly tricked me into signing divorce papers, all to give his mistress and their unborn child a complete family. I watched, fully conscious, as the man who once professed his undying love for me said the same words to someone else. Not long after, he showed up at my wedding, holding his child, trying to break through the barriers to reach the ceremony. He cried out hysterically, "Alice, you said we would torment each other. How can you go back on your word?" Chapter 1. In a daze, I heard distant, muffled voices slowly seeping into my ears, like water filling a vessel, creating a resonant echo. "Alice, I'm helping you with your homework, and you're just lazing around here? Get up, or I'll tell your teacher." The harsh tone made me frown. He was really fierce, always trying to scare people. I slowly opened my eyes, only to find the light outside excessively bright. The smell of disinfectant filled my nostrils, making me cough. Shadows moved in front of me. Someone was holding my hand. "Doctor! What are you standing there for? Go get the doctor. She's awake, she's awake." As my consciousness returned, dreams and reality overlapped. Henry stood above me, looking coldly as I struggled and sank in the pool. "Alice, stop making a scene, okay? Emily didn't do it on purpose. You can't have children. Do you want the Johnson family to end with us? The child needs a complete family. Let's get the divorce papers as soon as possible." The petite girl in his arms buried her head in his chest, her belly swollen. She murmured something softly. Henry held her and left without looking back. A stranger named Henry unfolded before me. "Who are you?" As the crowd dispersed, he stood there stunned. His eyes were dark, his brows furrowed, and then he spoke indifferently. "You don't remember me?" I looked into his eyes, silent. It wasn't that I didn't remember, I just didn't dare to recognize him. The Henry in my memory would never do such cruel things as he did in reality. How could he allow someone to push me into the pool? The doctor returned and diagnosed. The drowning lasted too long. Although the critical period has passed, the prolonged lack of blood and oxygen to the brain could indeed cause memory loss. He breathed a sigh of relief, his gaze becoming firm. "Alice, you accidentally fell into the pool on your way to get the divorce papers. Do you remember?" I followed his words and asked, "Accidentally?" Henry's expression remained calm, avoiding my gaze. "Yes, so let's get the divorce papers as soon as you're discharged." I felt my tightly pressed lips curve into a smile. I laughed at him and at myself. "All right." Playing the role of a blank slate to maintain my dignity was the most complete ending I could think of for this story. Henry, don't regret it. Chapter 2. Henry and I grew up together as our families were close friends. From babbling as toddlers to taking our first steps, from innocent childhood to youthful exuberance, we spent 25 years together. But in the 3rd year of our marriage, it all came to an abrupt end. The first time the fragile little mistress caught my eye was actually at our wedding. Henry had just graduated from college and taken over a branch of the family business. The first thing he did to establish himself was to fulfill a promise he made in his youth. "I, Henry, will marry Alice when I grow up." At 17, I jumped onto his shoulders in my blue and white school uniform and asked, "What if you regret it?" "Henry, you'll turn into a puppy. Only puppies break their promises." So, at the backstage of our wedding, he hugged me and whispered, his breath hot against my neck like a weak electric current, just as he had said before. "Alice, I've been thinking about marrying you for many years." Emily stood not far away, holding a stack of urgent documents, standing still in the backlight. I nudged him, indicating that his secretary seemed to have something urgent. He stepped away, and I followed, inviting. "Miss Emily, have something to eat before you go." "No," Henry stiffly explained. "Alice, she has work to do. Emily echoed, her expression showing a hint of disappointment. Having spent over 20 years together, I keenly sensed his emotions. For the first time, I seriously looked at Emily, the secretary specially recruited to his side. She was beautiful and delicate, like a white gardenia glowing in the light. I smiled at her, declaring my sovereignty as I linked arms with my husband and walked into the wedding hall. Perhaps it was a grave, who knew? The conflict erupted on our second wedding anniversary. I received an anonymous text message. It read, "Alice, why deceive yourself?" Emily stood where I once stood, intimately linking arms with her boss. Under the dim light, my husband, who once professed his love for me, lowered his head and kissed another woman deeply. One photo after another, I threw them onto the fondant cake wrapped in roses, hysterically questioning him as a wife. The spilled hot tea scalded my hand, making it red and swollen. He, however, remained excessively calm, retrieving a manila envelope from the study and handing it to me. I didn't take it. He placed it in front of me. "Alice, I'm doing this for your own good." Word by word, he cruelly revealed the truth. "You can't have children, so I have to find someone to replace you, don't you think?" He stood up, his shadow enveloping me. "Don't make a fuss. You remember, I once said I would only love you. So just be Mrs. Johnson and don't think about anything else." He said it all. The sunset also drew its curtain. I was exhausted, curling up on the sofa. "Henry, then let's torment each other. Let no one be spared, let no one regret." Henry didn't seem to care about such words, cutting a clean piece of cake. "Happy second anniversary." Left in front of me was, "Happy." I coldly lowered my eyes, looking at the extremely ironic words. Thinking, if that wedding was our end, it would have been better. Chapter 3. For a long time after that, the little mistress became even more blatant, openly uploading videos of their love on social media. I also openly spied on the love that once belonged to me and the love I had never seen before. Like Emily whispering to the camera, "I'm very picky about food. Let me show you what my dear boss is doing." The camera turned. Henry patiently picked out the cilantro from her bowl, bit by bit, and then placed the tempura from his own meal in front of her. This used to belong to me. Or like, in a candid shot, Emily pretended to sleep on the office sofa, testing if my husband would drape his suit over her. I stared at the screen without blinking. Until Henry sighed, helplessly taking his suit from the rack and gently placing it over her. Emily then wrapped her arms around his neck, and as they embraced, the video started to loop. This was something I had never seen. I asked myself, "Alice, is this interesting? Wouldn't it be better to let each other go?" But why should I? Clearly, the story began with his promise to me, yet it had to end with my pain. It was too unfair. I refused to admit that the childhood friendship was actually a fragile bubble that would burst at a touch. So I started pretending to be indifferent, occasionally liking their lovey-dovey videos when I was bored. Emily sent me a private message. "Sister, haven't you heard the saying? Only the unloved one is the third party. Why do you insist on keeping Henry tied to you?" I sent a screenshot of the chat to Henry and asked him, "Do you think so too?" After waiting all night, I received a reply. "Alice, don't provoke her." Advising the wife not to provoke the mistress. "Henry, you really opened my eyes." I laughed until I cried, wondering for a long time what I had done wrong. Chapter 4. I began making my last attempts to save this precarious marriage. But the lunches I sent were thrown into the trash, and the messages I sent were blocked as spam. The light I left on for him never went out. Until he called me, his tone complicated. "There's a family dinner at the old house tonight. Come with me." We hadn't seen each other since our second anniversary. "All right. Will you pick me up?" A girl's reluctant hum came through the receiver. After a moment of silence, Henry spoke. "Come by yourself. We'll meet under the banyan tree. Alice, I have something to tell you. Just as well, I have something to tell you too." The call ended. It's funny, my husband seemed more like a qualified partner when he was with another woman. It turns out, I could regret too. The so-called mutual torment ended up trapping only me. That day, I wore the dress he had prepared for me. A red dress. It was a bit small, and the zipper on the back could only be held with a pin. But I still squeezed myself into it. Like the wicked stepmother in a fairy tale, trying to fit into Cinderella's glass slipper, Henry was momentarily stunned when he saw me, then personally killed my last bit of hope. Emily is pregnant. 5.5 months. It's a boy. I wore a delicate makeup, hiding behind a heavy mask. Even if I found it funny, I remained expressionless. Then I asked him, "Henry, is it really that hard to admit you like someone else? You know. Why bother coming up with such indecent excuses and then openly hurting me?" He seemed annoyed at being exposed, responding angrily, "Yes. I liked her long before you imagined." Satisfied? "Alice, you insisted on marrying me. Didn't you think of this day when you had your father force me?" "My father forced you?" I knew nothing about what he mentioned. But I still stubbornly sought confirmation. "So you married me just because of that? Is this another excuse?" "Henry, I find it disgusting." He responded in silence. Something shattered completely in that moment. At the family dinner that night, my expression didn't reveal a single flaw. I raised my glass with ease, celebrating the old man's 70th birthday. And celebrating the end of my fantasy. I remembered, before the wedding, my father patting my head, already giving the answer. "Alice, do you know the secret to maintaining a marriage? It's interest, it's unbreakable interest." I wanted to tell him no. There are things more important than interest. He wouldn't give it, and I didn't want it anymore. Chapter 5. Admitting that I lost completely isn't such a big deal. Emily came to see me, her belly swollen. Barefaced, wearing only sunglasses. Compared to my full armor, it was hard to tell who was more guilty, who was the real third party. Skipping the boasting and provocation, the whole conversation was actually pointless, except for the promise I left her. "We will divorce, but not now." The entanglement between Henry, Emily, and me was not something to be proud of. Even though Emily later deleted the videos from social media, the gossip still spread through the circles, eventually reaching Henry's father's ears. Actually, there was an incident at the end of that family dinner. Mr. Johnson called Henry to the study. While they argued, I stood at the door, listening to the sound of a slow knife peeling away the skin, the bloody heart being taken out, and dying completely. "Marry that woman outside? Don't even think about it." Under the authoritative voice, Henry responded calmly. "Dad, I just want to make a decision for myself once, instead of having price tags all over me, including my marriage, packaged and sold. Buy, sell. That was really a bad deal." After the family punishment and kneeling in the ancestral hall, Mr. Johnson found me, almost pleading. "Alice, Henry has wronged you, and I'm apologizing on his behalf. But the Johnson Group is preparing to go public, and it can't withstand such turmoil. Can you, for my sake, give him another chance? At least until the IPO, maintain the facade of harmony. Destroying a family's hard work because of our issues. Besides, everyone except Henry treated me well. A promise made must be kept." No need to explain to Emily. When I told her, her face was full of disbelief. At the lakeside cafe, as I walked to the car, Emily called out to me. There were no cameras here, no one around. She got very close, and I could only try to avoid her. "Alice, I can't afford to gamble. What you said is just an empty promise to me." Emily paused, then grabbed my hand. "Do you want to feel Henry's baby?" I forcefully shook her off, calling her crazy. She staggered, falling towards the pool. Pushing her onto the tiles and letting myself fall into the water. Henry quickly ran over, kneeling beside Emily, glaring at me. Clearly, the harsh tone was the same, but it contradicted the image in my memory. "Alice, you can swim. Stop making a scene, okay? Emily didn't do it on purpose. You can't have children. Do you want the Johnson family to end with us? I'm really fed up with you." The child needs a complete family. Let's get the divorce papers as soon as possible. As Henry carried his beloved away, he might have forgotten that in college, he only taught me half of the swimming lesson before rushing off to the club. Later, I found out that someone was waiting for him at the club. Maybe it was Emily, maybe it was another girl. It didn't matter anymore. I thought, if I was gone in front of him, would he feel guilty, regretful? The thought flashed by, and I remembered my parents. Then I struggled desperately to the surface, sinking deeper instead. In a daze, a blurry figure broke through the water. I reached out to the shadow. "Save me, he's not worth it." I silently shouted in my heart. Someone leaned down to give me air, the taste of mint leaves, filling my breath. Chapter 6. Maybe out of guilt, or perhaps due to external pressure, Henry ultimately didn't tear off his mask. He even took on the tedious hospital tasks himself. The phone rang every 2 hours, and he gently comforted the woman on the other end. After hanging up, he noticed my gaze and stood there for a while. He awkwardly explained, "Alice, our marriage has long been a sham." I coldly snorted, turning my back to him, unwilling to face this liar anymore. In a nearly indifferent tone, I asked, "Who saved me?" After everyone left, that shadowy figure. It couldn't have been him. "You don't remember?" I nodded, genuinely not remembering. His apple peeling paused and he inexplicably laughed. "I thought you just didn't want to remember me." But in reality, my mind was overflowing with unpleasant memories of Henry. Probably from taking care of people too much, the apple skin was peeled into a thin layer, coiled and thrown into the trash. Eat it, if you can't remember, don't think about it. When the ambulance arrived, that person left. I didn't see who it was. He lied, habitually rubbing the second joint of his index finger. I observed. Nodded. "Henry, don't come again. The divorce papers are in the last drawer of the desk. Already signed." Henry rarely went back, and this parting gift had gone unnoticed for so long. He didn't turn around, just stood with his back to me, saying the final goodbye. Not regretting? Of course. Henry, the one who should regret isn't me. Chapter 7. In the following days, my parents stayed by my side in the hospital room without leaving. Occasionally, in the dead of night, I would hide under the covers and cry silently. I cried for the 25 years that were wiped away in a stroke. I cried for the absurdity of my youth. Then my mother would hold me, singing the lullaby from my childhood, her voice growing hoarse as she sang. "My Alice, if only you really couldn't remember." I couldn't suppress my sobs. My acting was so clumsy and childish in the eyes of those close to me, yet it effortlessly deceived him. Not long after, we arranged to meet at the marriage registration office. I remembered how well he had acted when we first got our marriage certificate. Loving me, even if it was just a task, he still managed to act as if he couldn't bear to part with me, placing the 2 red booklets in the most conspicuous place in the car, kissing me non-stop as if he couldn't wait to devour me. He used to say, "Alice, have pity on me. Just grant me this one time." 3 years later, he also said, "Alice, have pity on me. Just grant us this one time." He and I were simply not meant to be. As I walked out, a lone man ascended the steps, stopping in front of me. I couldn't recall any connection with him. However, Henry's reaction was more intense, coldly speaking from behind. "Alice, is this what you mean by not remembering? So eager?" The man stopped in front of me, naturally taking my handbag. Dressed in a black suit, his hair was dyed a distinctive light color. I stepped back slightly. "Who are you?" "Driver." He smoothly took the small bag from my hand. Seeing Henry's face turn livid, I glanced at him. "Henry, don't assume others are like you." I walked away without looking back. Chapter 8. The car door closed, and the man extended his hand, his fingers long and slender. "Let's reintroduce ourselves," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Sean." There was no need to get to know a driver. Yet, when I extended my hand, I couldn't even tell what I was thinking, just naturally shaking his hand. Until the car stopped in front of the villa, and he efficiently moved the pre-packed luggage out, I was still pondering our connection. As I was about to leave, Henry drove into the garage, carefully helping the pregnant woman out of the back seat, walking into what used to be our home. Sean seemed angrier than I was, the veins on his arms bulging. I looked away. "Mr. Sean, were we very familiar before?" "Not really. If you must say I was a failed suitor." Failed. A story formed in my mind. For example, in order to get back at Henry, I flirted with Sean, but he rejected me. An unsuccessful affair. He sighed, raising the soundproof glass. "I pursued you." The scent of nicotine mixed with a faint minty freshness approached me. In an overstepping gesture, he picked up the bottle of mineral water farthest from him and handed it to me, signaling with his eyes. "You're bleeding." It was from the day I fell into the pool. Perhaps because I needed a hard distraction when recalling certain things, the wound hadn't healed, occasionally reopening. The car started and stopped again, parking in an empty hall at the corner. Sean sat for a while, then turned to me. "Wait here for a moment? I forgot something inside." He got out of the car methodically. Feeling uneasy, I hesitated for 2 seconds before following him. I watched as he nearly frantically returned to Henry's side, each punch drawing blood. Emily, protecting her belly, hid to the side, looking terrified, a far cry from her previous arrogance. When I ran to pull them apart, a cut appeared on Sean's face. He even hid behind me somewhat aggrievedly. I looked coldly at the bruised and swollen Henry, saying, "Henry, it's over between us. If you cause trouble again, you won't be able to bear the consequences." Enough to destroy everything he had. Chapter 9. Sean drove me to my apartment. It was a birthday gift from my father on my coming-of-age day. When he heard the destination, the man visibly hesitated, wanting to say something but stopping. Until I saw with my own eyes, the furniture that should have been scattered, even with regular cleaning, shouldn't look like this. A wardrobe packed to the brim. A pink main color scheme. Matching toiletries by the sink, all proving its use. I remembered the key I gave Henry when I was 18, solemnly and ridiculously, like playing a game as a child. Our home. It ended up being their home. Disgusting. I listed the house with an agent and dragged my suitcase downstairs. Sean leaned against the car, a cigarette dangling from his lips, lost in thought. When he saw me coming down, he squinted, looking confused until I approached, then quickly snapped out of it and walked over. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, it's too dirty. I want to live somewhere else." I studied his features, standing still. Sean stood quietly, letting me look, his silver hair soft and inviting. My heart skipped a beat, an inexplicable palpitation, but I didn't know where it came from. I took out the divorce certificate from my bag. "Is this okay?" I asked. He looked into my eyes and nodded. On the day of the divorce, with a sense of revenge and inexplicable palpitation, I gave myself to another man. No need to test feelings. He clasped my hands from behind, kissing me all over, pulling me into a storm. When it ended, the car stopped at the Civil Affairs Bureau. I was dazed from the kisses, and he gently removed the hair stuck to my cheek. No chance to regret. No need to regret. When I held the red booklet in my hand, I finally realized what I had done. In and out twice. Was it really for revenge? As he tentatively held my hand, I asked, "What if my intentions aren't pure?" "Mine aren't either." In the car, swaying, he devoured me piece by piece. At the peak of emotion, he whispered in my ear, his voice light. "Little heartless one, did you really forget me?" That night, I had a dream. In the dream, Sean stood soaking wet, away from the crowd. Until the ambulance door closed, his figure disappeared. Chapter 10. The phone rang incessantly until morning. When I finally answered, an angry voice questioned me, making me feel dazed. "Why didn't you answer the phone last night?" Double quotes. Do you know how many times I called? So what? Turning over, the tearing pain made me gasp. There was silence on the other end for 2 seconds. Alice, what are you doing? 3 questions in a row. I retorted angrily. Mr. Henry, in what capacity are you questioning me? Ex-husband? You always said people should know their place. I didn't expect to return this sentence to you one day. Sean walked in as I frowned, confronting the voice on the other end. He called me, wife? I was stunned for a moment, ignoring the hysterics on the other end, and hung up. Sean's hair was still dripping, like a wet puppy, overlapping with the figure in my dream. I tentatively asked, was it you who saved me that day? His movements stopped, his ears turning slightly red. The answer was obvious. When a thick stack of asset proofs and equity transfer documents was placed in front of me. Driver? Just your private driver. These are just side jobs. He looked into my eyes, saying, Alice, I will never lie to you. Do I believe him? He wasn't the first to say that to me. But when I took him to meet my parents, he was even more familiar with them than I was. My mother wiped her tears, saying, if only it had been him earlier. An incomplete sentence. He coaxed them away, giving me a deep look before leaving. I inexplicably thought of last night. The same fire in his eyes, as if it would burn me. When the dinner ended, the driver was already waiting at the door. Not long after we started driving, a white SUV sped towards us, crashing straight into us. With a loud bang, the car shook violently, and Sean tightly protected me. In the moment of silence inside the car, through the window, Henry called my name repeatedly. You're degrading yourself just to force me to remarry? Stop dreaming, Alice. I will only marry her. His eyes were bloodshot, his neck red from drunkenness. I laughed until I cried, unable to discern his motive for coming here. In Henry's eyes, it turned into unwavering devotion to him. I leaned closer to Sean, speaking softly. I'll cover the car damage. Can it still drive? Sean's eyes darkened, like ink spilling from a broken inkstone. Alice, from now on, you only need to be responsible for me. I'll collect his debts. Chapter 11. So, on my first day infiltrating my own company under a hidden identity, a long string of apology statements flooded the internet, signed by Henry, the golden boy of the Henry family. The important part was the last line, driven by love, acted impulsively. Everyone speculated who the lover was, guessing Sean's interference. The girl at the next desk gossiped during breaks, talking about Henry's loyalty and deep affection. This lover must be the daughter of our group. Henry often mentioned her in public, cherishing her deeply. But now, sigh, things have changed. I smiled faintly, saying nothing. Until Emily brought a swarm of reporters to block the company entrance, surrounded tightly, and my phone on the desk kept ringing. Only then did everyone change their tune, realizing Henry's promiscuity and numerous affairs. Finishing the last stroke, I stared at the mirror in a daze, thinking of Mr. Johnson's humble plea and my reluctant agreement. A promise made must be kept. But now, Emily's self-exposure destroyed all the calm facade. When the long guns and iron cannons flashed blinding lights at me, it finally led to my confrontation with Emily. She knelt at my feet, her tear-streaked face indistinguishable from truth or falsehood. Alice, Henry and I truly love each other, and I have his child. Please, for the sake of this child, stay away from him. I couldn't help but laugh, avoiding the reporters' microphones, squatting beside her. All these years, the problem wasn't me. What? Didn't Henry tell you? The medical report from a year after our marriage. Henry handled it all. That night, he drank heavily, crying in my arms until I softened, taking on all the rumors. He only needed to maintain the facade of unwavering loyalty. But he couldn't even do that. So, from the beginning, someone as proud as him would rather deceive himself and take responsibility for Emily's child. Besides true love, I couldn't find a more reasonable explanation. Emily stood frozen, disbelief in her eyes. I stood up, exposing the divorce certificate to the cameras, looking down at her. As you wish. After severing interests, the cards in each group's hands were reshuffled. I thought I could finally have some peace. The next news about Henry came 2 months later. The Henry Group stock plummeted before its IPO, and shareholders withdrew their investments. During this time, Henry's father never called, busy attending various press conferences. The two troublemakers never showed up. Until the child was born prematurely, and the Johnson family was in chaos, the IPO plan completely failed. The debt agreement left the Johnson family in ruins. The once prestigious family was nearly driven to the brink by rumors from all directions. Absurd yet real. Chapter 12. Sean had no interest in fighting for this piece of the pie. By day, he played the role of a competent private driver. By night, he held me tightly, whispering sweet nothings that made my heart race. So, when Emily called repeatedly in the middle of the night, Sean reluctantly stopped. Through the receiver, she cried hysterically, accompanied by the sound of wind. Alice. Why? Why? I had asked that question countless times. She laughed. You played me for a fool, just to prove his pathetic male dignity. Don't you find it funny? Emily, your affairs have nothing to do with me. I was about to hang up when she continued her monologue. If I jump from here, do you think he'll regret it? I signaled Sean to call the police while trying to calm her. Where are you? She didn't answer. Those photos sent to me before, you had someone take them. Hey so what? You won, what more do you want? She suddenly broke down, the signal fluctuating. When? Do you know the origin of that child? What if I said Henry personally arranged it and drugged me? Someone like him deserves a miserable end. As soon as she finished, the phone hit the water with a loud splash. The police had already pinpointed her location. In my days, I pieced together the story. Henry was rotten to the core. I vomited in the bathroom. After 2 years of sharing a bed, his true nature was revealed after we parted. When I was called to the police station to give a statement, I learned that Emily didn't survive. I didn't go to see her. At the end of the hallway, I saw Henry in a cloud of smoke. He grinned at me, seemingly unaffected, walking closer step by step. Sean stood in front of me, confronting him. I pulled Sean back, meeting Henry's eyes, so different from before. Mad, seeking credit. He leaned close to my ear, whispering, Alice, don't you understand? I loved you too much to hurt you. You should understand my good intentions. Good intentions? Someone like him had no heart. He would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. Madman. I shook my head slowly but firmly, then walked away with Sean without looking back. The story ended in a messy way. Chapter 13. I used almost all my strength to establish myself in the company. When I could stand on my own, I found out I was expecting. In my hesitation, Sean stayed by my side without leaving. One evening, unable to sleep, I saw him standing alone by the floor-to-ceiling window. I didn't know what he was looking at, staring intently. I quietly approached from behind, peeking over his shoulder to see a square photo in his hand. 17-year-old me. At 17, my world was all about Henry. I had no memory of the man in front of me. When I suddenly spoke, Sean finally came back to his senses, covering the photo with his hand. You haven't told me about the past. Exchanging secrets. In his words, I was loved, firmly chosen. It seemed like I just took a wrong turn, then reunited at the end. At a certain point, my expression turned strange. Sean, I even thought I had really lost my memory. I knew you wouldn't, so I could only secretly tell you my feelings. He paused, his eyes filled with unease. If you want to hear, I can say it many times. No need to worry about being discovered by you and hiding in the corner. That night, he said a lot. Holding me, his tone was filled with disbelief. He couldn't believe I really kept the baby. Fool! No one stays stuck in the past forever. I would eventually fall in love with someone else. Maybe it was the first time I saw Sean, maybe it was during our time together. So, on our wedding day, the guests filled the seats. He held my hand as we walked down the aisle. When the ring was placed on my finger, there was a commotion outside. We ignored it, finishing our vows. When the dust settled, Henry appeared at the door, holding a swaddled baby. Now fallen from grace, he had lost all his former glory. Stopped by the police behind him. Amidst the baby's cries, he wailed hysterically. "Alice, you said we would torment each other. How can you go back on your word?" People must look forward. Those stuck in the past are the losers. Chapter 14. The baby was taken by a policewoman and Henry was led into the police car. The golden boy, committing absurd crimes for so-called dignity, would face his punishment. Only the child was pitiful. Fortunately, Henry's father sold his shares and left with the baby. Later, on the day our baby turned 1 month old, we received a longevity lock from a small town. The letter wished for peace and safety, addressing him as Mr. Johnson, as at the beginning of the story. But years had passed and things had changed. Sean pulled me into his arms. Surrounded by family and friends, I was finally heading towards my bright future. So, when our baby started walking, my father handed the company over to me, spending his days doting on his granddaughter, becoming a hands-off boss. Since then, every day after work, the sight of the head of the Johnson family picking up his wife could be seen at the company entrance. Just like he said, repeating the words he didn't dare to say in his youth, over and over again.